As anyone who has spent pretty much any time on this channel will know, I don't tend to focus in that much on action movies. It tends to be more thrillers and, of course, especially undervalued horror that I hone in on the most. But occasionally I do stray away from that to move into certain action films which really stood out and appealed to me, something like, for instance, Dredd, or in this case, a movie which of course is often referred to as being very similar to Dredd. They even came out around a similar time, The Raid. This is a movie which doesn't necessarily make the crazy money of something like Transformers, but I would say is a far better film than many of those ultra-high earners from, for instance, Hollywood. Now, this movie was directed by Gareth Edwards, the second one is as well, and it stars some names who are kind of up-and-comers in the West, and of course, primarily I'm talking about Iko Uwais, I think. I'm not sure exactly how you pronounce his name, don't really want to butcher it, but he's the primary character in the movie. And this one, I think, even more so than the second film, has a very appealing purity to it. The Raid is a pure, straight-up adrenaline action film, and there are plenty of movies which use that kind of marketing and have those kind of blurbs on the DVD cover, on the Blu-ray cover, because it tends to be a hot-button kind of word to refer to this. Adrenaline-fueled, white-knuckle, all of these overused words. But I would say that if any movie deserves that kind of blurb, it's this one. In fact, especially the first one, because although we are going to also review The Raid 2, probably next week in fact on the channel, a movie which incidentally I do like even more than this first one, I will say that this first one has a much more simplistic and I would say rewatchability to it that the second one actually doesn't have as much for me, because although the second one I think is a better story and a better film, I think that this one has more rewatchability. It's a purer, simpler, more streamlined, just badass, as I said, adrenaline journey in effect, in a similar way to Dredd, but even more fast-paced. And it also doesn't have the kind of over-the-top aspect that Dredd has quite as much. This movie can still be over-the-top, but it manages to feel fairly grounded most of the time, to the point where some of the actors, some of the extras doing the special effects, doing stunts, look like they're going through quite a bit of actual pain because of the stuff that they're doing. Now, the movie revolves around a very simple concept. It's in effect a SWAT team, you could say, attacking this high-rise block of relatively run-down apartments, which are full of basically undesirable criminal people who are all the tenants of a big boss, as it were, right at the top. So just like Dredd, it's a similar kind of concept. And of course there are certain things that you'd expect from something like an action or thriller cop drama or SWAT drama, such as like backstabbing, twists, turns, who's with who's against who might have a change of heart down the line. All of these kind of things are always there. You kind of expect that to happen. But I like that this movie doesn't necessarily rely on those. There are certain things in the story which you could completely remove and it would still be, I would say, just as enjoyable. Certain ties, certain connections, certain enemies, certain friends, which you could easily simplify even more, and the pure appeal of the film would definitely still be there. Now, as I said, it revolves around them basically taking down this entire building, but primarily the boss man at the top. But on the way, things go wrong. Of course, he figures out that they're there, locks down the entire building, and due to the fact that kind of conveniently everyone in the building is essentially Bruce Lee, it makes it very interesting as far as the fighting goes. But at the same time, you can of course hold your suspension of disbelief for a film like this in a similar way to some of the over-the-top stuff that happens in Brawl in Cell Block 99, for instance, which is one of my favourite films, as I said in my review for it. Because of the fact that the movie is so good, you can quite readily suspend your disbelief, because it's worth doing that with. And I think the movies where people tend to not like doing that, such as for instance the aforementioned Transformers, it's because it doesn't feel justified. You don't really have any reason to suspend your disbelief because the whole thing is ridiculous. It doesn't give you any rewarding payoff for it. Whereas I would say this movie definitely does, in a similar way to how Dredd does as well. Now, as far as the scores, of course it's not really an artistic type of movie. It doesn't play on the same kinds of themes and filmmaking that many of the other movies that I talk about do. For instance, lack of sound, for instance, good sound design to be creepy or scary, because again, it's not a horror film. So the way that I score it, of course, is the same, but the scores are almost like in their own way. They're not the same kind of scoring that I'd give to a horror movie, so with that in mind, what are the scores going to be? Well, as far as the story and plot, I'm going to give it a 6, which might sound a little bit too low, and of course super fans of the film would probably want me to give it really high scores, like an 8 or a 10 for everything, but still I have to be objective, and comparing it not just to other action films, but to horror, thrillers, various others as well, it's certainly not worthy, honestly and objectively speaking, regardless of how much I love it, of having like an 8 or a 9 or a 10. It's a super simple story which does exactly what it needs to do, with interesting characters, which we'll get to in a second, but the story itself, you've got to admit, it's simple. Now, it's simple for a reason, and it works very well because of it. It doesn't need it to be, you know, Inception or The Matrix. It's not trying to be. So for what it wanted to do, or what it needed to do, it did it well, and that's why I'm scoring it above par with a 6, because of course, for those who don't know, my scoring system starts at a 5, and can then either go up or down. So what then about the characters? Well, the characters are very good. I think that one character in particular called Mad Dog, and I don't really want to butcher the actor's name, but it appears to be pronounced Yatan Rumian. I'm not sure though, it's probably completely wrong, but the character that he plays is called Mad Dog. He's pretty much the smallest guy in the whole film, and none of the actors are particularly tall, and his skills, he's a long-haired guy as well, slightly older chap compared to the others, but his skills in combat are way beyond pretty much everyone else in the film. He can fairly easily take down people as if it's just a game for him, and he's easily the most interesting character. There's a lot of implied, not backstory, but implied personality to him. You kind of get the impression that there's a lot more to him, and incidentally, without spoiling anything, that's kind of played on, but not necessarily in the way that you might expect me to be talking about. And again, I can't really say why without spoiling it. But yeah, for me, he was easily the most interesting character, and even though he was a villain, technically speaking, he was, I think, the most badass character in the film, easily. He has a very Malaysian Jason Bourne kind of look to him in terms of how he deals with fighting, deals with pain. He almost feels like this just unstoppable force in the film, but again, in a strangely believable way. You get the impression that this guy probably would be hopped up on some kind of performance-enhancing drug, angel dust or something like that, where he probably would just continue on through the pain, and even though his body would eventually give up, his mind still wouldn't, and you definitely get that vibe from him, just like you would with Jason Bourne. Like, nothing really phases the guy, he just deals with whatever's thrown at him. And of course the main character has that attitude as well, but he's a good guy, so the kind of stuff that he's willing to do, the way that he fights, he's always in effect kind of pulling his punches in a funny kind of way, because even though people die and he kills people, he's kind of doing it in the most efficient way. He doesn't play around with people, and he's a good guy at heart, you can tell that. Whereas with Mad Dog, of course that's not the case, and to me that definitely gives him the edge. As far as the visuals, the effects in the film, of course makeup, and especially in a movie like this, arguably far more so than in most horror or thriller movies, the stunts. The stunt work, the choreography, the way the fighting is shot, it's brilliant. It's easily one of the best action films ever for pure fighting. If you're looking for non-stop fights, be it with guns, knives, fists, whatever, it's got it all in this film. Again, sometimes very Bourne-esque, and all the better for it. So overall, I'm going to give it a 9. It's a very easy 9, and I think the only reason why I'm not going to give it a full 10 is because some of the camera quality, some of the lighting sometimes can be a little bit, not cheap, but not necessarily quite as polished as maybe the fighting deserved. So I think for me that just holds it back a little bit from a full 10, but at the same time it looks great and the choreography is incredible, it's shot very well, and that would definitely be continued on to the second film, which we'll talk about in due time. As far as the soundtrack, the music, of course effects, not so much in a movie like this, but still to some degree, bones cracking, guns firing, that kind of stuff. I'm going to give it another 6, because for me, a very important thing with this kind of adrenaline-fueled, non-stop sort of action film, in a very Train to Busan kind of sense, where the tension never drops, the soundtrack is hugely important. And unlike horror, where an absence of sound can be very effective, in an action film you have to have a soundtrack or music which complements the speed, the ferocity and the skill of the fight. and in this movie it definitely does. There's a lot of very thumpy, high BPM songs, you could say, the soundtrack in general, really, and it definitely complements it well. It's not an overly memorable soundtrack per se, because, as I said, it's more of a beat, but at the same time it works very well. I think the reason why I'm not scoring it even higher is because of the expected simplicity of it. It doesn't really wow you, it just does what it should do, and it does it very well. And finally, of course, as far as the most subjective to me personally, the rewatchability, the entertainment factor, well, for that the movie's easily a 7. And I could probably talk myself into giving it maybe an 8 or a 9, and for some people it would easily be a 10. I've heard certain people talk about this movie in such a way that it's essentially their favourite action film, either this or the second one, and I can completely understand that line of logic. I think that this one and the second one might actually be my two favourite action films, at least off the top of my head at the moment, because I'm not much of an action fan. I've seen plenty of action films, but they've never really been my real passion as far as movies go. I can certainly enjoy a good one though, and both The Raid and The Raid 2 are definitely excellent examples of that, especially excellent modern ones. So as far as the rewatchability with a 7, what I mean by that is that I think it's a great all-rounder. It's the kind of movie that you could definitely watch again on your own. It's fantastic on the first viewing. It's the kind of movie which you might even feel like you want to watch back to back. It is that fast-paced and that good. The runtime of both movies is a little long, but at the same time they don't feel slow and it doesn't feel unnecessary. It's just something that you should bear in mind. You do need to set aside a little bit of time to watch these films. It's not like It Comes at Night where it flies past in 90 minutes. There's a bit more to it than that. And as far as rewatchability with friends, well, it's fantastic for that, and that's one of the biggest advantages of action films. They don't tend to rely on dialogue too much. There's a lot of wow factor going on with the thumpy music, the crazy visuals, the great choreography. It's the beauty of an action film. It's perfect for group watching. You can talk over it but still enjoy it, and as I've said with a couple of other films, there are definitely certain sequences, certain fights, certain moments which will just naturally draw the attention of the group regardless of who's already talking. And there's a fight towards the end of the film in particular involving 3 people in kind of a freezer, which definitely does that. It's fantastic. So overall, I'm giving the first Raid movie a very respectable score of 3.4 out of 5, and I think this is one of those reviews where there are plenty of people who would score it far higher because of their love for it, and I can completely understand that. Just for me, trying to be more objective, I have to hold it back in a couple of ways. In particular, of course, the story and the characters, which are great for what it is, but not exactly groundbreaking in overall sense. So it just wouldn't be fair to more complex movies with incredible performances on more of an emotional scale rather than a skill of the fight range, if you will. It wouldn't be fair to put this movie on that same pedestal. So those are pretty much the only things that hold it back for me. But as far as action films go, it's fantastic. It's easily one of my favourites, as I said. So of course stick around on the channel for the second movie review, as I said, probably next week. And overall, if you haven't seen The Raid, which I guess quite a few people probably still haven't, and a lot of people haven't seen Dread either, then definitely do so. If you watch both movies, you'll definitely see the similarities, and it'll be interesting to see which one you prefer. I think for me, I prefer The Raid, even though I think the character of Dread is cooler. I think the film of The Raid is better, because it's just that little bit more believable, and that kind of gives it a harder, more aggressive edge, with kind of a British vibe to it, which makes sense, given the director. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.